This is ClarkeTheKnife, and these are the Demko AD 20.5. One of the hottest knives the last couple of years, and we're going to see how it stands up. We got two versions here. We got our gray G10. This one is in the slicer shark blade shape with 20 CV blade steel. And this one here is in a clip point blade with S35 VN as the steel. Other than that blade shape and the color of the G10, they are identical. We're going to focus on this clip point for most of the review because that's the version I like better. But as we'll go into, pretty much the same knife here. This tree is going to go through 5 points, and you're going to be able to see them tracked down here in your bottom right corner. First, we're going to go through some specifications, price, weight, things like that. Then we are going to go through what these knives do well. Then we're going to go through some areas that they might struggle. We're going to talk about fit, finish, and value. And finally, we're going to get to our overall conclusions. So let's get to it. So first, your AD 20.5 here. Again, we'll move this one out of the way, come back to it later. This is a $250 knife retail. Always like to get the price right out of the way. Made in Taiwan by Demko Knives. So Demko Knives, brief background. Very well-known custom knife maker for many years, John Andrew Demko. A few years back, they started making production scale knives out of their factory in Wampum, Pennsylvania, which is on the west side of the state. And those are priced about similar to a Hinderer. Their AD20 and their AD20S, those are $450 to $600 knives in most variants. Then they came out with these a couple of years ago, made in Taiwan, quite likely in some of the same factories that Demko built relationships with during his time supporting Cold Steel. And these come out in this version with your big fat pivot here and with premium blade seals and G10 handles. These come in around $250. Though usually with a code or something like that, you'll be able to get them for $225 or even $200 if you know which retailer to look at. These initially came out in cheaper versions that were in that high hundreds range with a smaller pivot and with cheaper blade steels, AUS 8, AUS 10, stuff like that, Grivery handles. The value proposition was a little more challenging because the materials were basically budget materials on a nearly $200 knife. This one here, now they're currently making them, and this is what you see for new AD 20.5s in the market these days. These are now premium materials in some form, premium blade seals, premium handle materials, and aiming for $250 for your G10 models, around $300 if you want to get in carbon fiber, and you can pay $350, $400 for a titanium handle version. And the Demkos even make, I want to say, Timascus versions, one of those special things that you can pay like $750 for one of these if you really want to. You've got a blade that's between 3 and 3.5 inches long here, 125 thousandths on the stock, which is a lot thinner than your other AD20 variations, all the ones that the Demkos make in their shop in Wampum. You've also got a relatively thin knife here, and this is around 3.5 ounces, so you're pretty close to 1 ounce an inch. This ends up being a thin knife, a relatively light knife for the blade size. Let's do a couple size comparisons here. So let's start with your PM2. This one here's got, rock scale designs, titanium scales on here. So you can see very similar in size to the PM2. But if you look at the thickness, it is, if anything, even thinner. You can see a little bit thinner than the PM2 across the board there. And certainly thinner on the blade stock. If you compare this to, maybe you're more familiar with your Para 3. So your Para 3 obviously is meant to be a small knife, but this is not that much larger than the Para 3 overall. And in fact, when you fold it up, because of how tall that Para 3 gets, actually takes up about the same amount of space in the pocket as your Para 3. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. Compare it to your Delica here. Much bigger than the Delica, obviously, but not that much thicker than the Delica. You're seeing sort of a trend here. And then let's compare it to one other smaller knife, your small Sebenza, right there. So about 15-20% longer in both the blade and the handle than your small Sebenza. There's a little bit of variation between blade shapes. where in particular these two are pretty similar. The third blade shape that's offered, I don't have it in AD 20.5, but it's the shark's foot. This is a shark cub, but it's this version that comes down to, it's basically a sheep's foot blade shape with a very low saber grind. And this version is always a little bit shorter than the others. So these blade shapes are about the same length. This one just sweeps up a little further. This one is a tiny bit longer. But you're talking, again, basically about PM2 size. Maybe a little bit smaller than the PM2 in both the blade and the handle, while being meaningfully lighter and, if anything, a little thinner. So those are your specifications. Now let's get to what this knife does well, and this knife does a lot well. So first off, the action. Everybody got excited about the AD 20.5 because of the action, and the reason is the shark lock here. So the shark lock, the easiest way to think about it is it's got a lot of similarity to a bar lock in the way that you've got something that is held by a spring. So there's a spring in the guts here. You push this back and the spring wants to push it forward again. And when I pull this back, the blade can swing freely. When it is allowed to slide forward, the blade cannot, and it's locked. And so when it's in the closed position, part of the blade tang in here, pushes against that, and you can see this shark lock moving back and forth. And so it's this spring here, or the spring that's in here, pushing this back forward, that's providing your detent. There's no traditional detent. There's no detent ball or anything like that. So when I try to open this, it'll snap back because that spring pushes the fin forward and pushes your blade back. So it gives you more of a sort of springy detent, not a hard, crisp detent like you get from a frame lock or even a compression lock. And then when it's open, you pull this back and it will shake shut. I mean, it really does drop shut if you're not doing it just like that. But while it is open, it is rock solid as any knife out there. Now, what this shark lock gives you is a complete free dropping action. And this is as good as an action gets if you want a fidgety action. I'll show the other one here just to show this a fluke. If anything, the action on this one is better. You release this, because when you release this, there is nothing interacting with the blade. If you've got something like your frame lock here, and obviously Sabenza is not really a fast action, but with a frame lock or even a compression lock, when I unlock the blade, part of your detent ball here is riding on the tang of the blade, the part that's in this pivot here the whole way. So there's friction just necessarily. That's why to get a fall shut action on a frame lock or compression lock, you pretty much need to use bearings and you need these really tight tolerances, or you just need a knife that's loose and has play and things like that. This is drop shutty for the same reason that an axis lock is drop shutty, which is when this lock is released, this blade is basically just falling free. And so that gives you a super fidgety action that still is very, very secure in the locked out position. No play. Actually, come to think of that, I do have a tiny bit of play right now. First time I've ever had play in this. No play up and down. There's no play in this one. And again, I've had this thing for months. Actually, the play is gone now. I probably just had a little bit of tension on this. Pretty much always no play in the blade, and you get a totally free dropping, free falling action that also is very easy to roll out, to flick out, and you can even just pull back on the spring and flip it out like that. The action is super fun, it's super fidgety, it's great. I'll also call out, the action is even better on the blades that have this thumb stud. This is one of the best thumb studs you're going to find on the market. It's basically just a series of stacked cylinders, but it's so easy to get your thumb on there. It's not pokey, it's not grabby. It's positioned very nicely where where you push it is pretty much perpendicular to the line between this pivot and this thumb stud. So you can flick it out very nicely, very easily. Or you can even just roll it out. You can slow roll this thumb stud very easily. It's very easy to get your hands onto, to get your thumb onto. It's satisfying. It doesn't tear up your thumb. It's just a really, really well done thumb stud. And honestly, I prefer the thumb stud variations, and I've had some of the larger Demkos as well. I consistently prefer the thumb stud variations of these knives to the ones that just have the opening hole from an action perspective. because these thumb studs are so well done. The next thing that these knives do really well, which I mentioned in some of the size comparisons, is they are not big knives. In particular, they are quite thin knives. Again, I'll bring out the Delica because the Delica is a notoriously thin knife. This is only a tiny bit thicker than your Delica. And if I compare it to your Para 3, it is thinner than the Para 3 and takes up not that much more space in the pocket. Because of the way that the Demkos have designed this knife, which is having relatively thin blade stock, again, 125 thousandths for something that is meant for heavier use and suitable for heavier use like this AD 20.5, 125 thousandths is reasonable stock. It's not thick. That is thinner than your Para 3 stock by quite a bit, 145 thousandths, 125 thousandths. Not only does that mean that this blade cuts well, which we'll get into in a second, but it means that the whole package is thinner. Your blade is not that thick. Your scales are right snug against that blade. There's very little daylight between the edges of the scales and the blade. And your liners are completely inset, and your G10 scales are not that thick. Same thing if you look at it. Almost cut myself there. If you look at it here, this is a thin knife in the pocket. And so one of the things that is surprising when you start to use this knife is how great it is to carry. This ends up being a relatively full-size knife that carries like a much smaller one. Again, this was about the same size as your something like a PM2 when it's fully deployed, but it feels so much smaller than a PM2 in the pocket, especially because of how thin it is and because of how much this blade does fold up into this handle. You know, you've got, it's basically a rectangle, so it's a thin rectangle in your pocket. This G10 texture here isn't grabby, and actually let's just jump into that because another thing that's great is the way they've done this G10. Rather than doing a peel apply pattern, they've done a diamond texture that gives you just enough grip. It gives you plenty of grip when your hands are on here. If it actually tries to move, I can just pinch this thing and my hands do not want to move. It does everything that a peel apply texture does, but it's less rough, it's less abrasive. It really just gives grippiness. It's not sharp, it's just a little grabby, and it works really well. It's also aesthetically really nice, a little bit more interesting to look at than a peel apply texture. On top of that, the finishing on these handles, the way they've done the G10 is very nice. We'll talk about finishing in more detail later, but these are just generally very nice G10 handles. And you can get these in carbon fiber, you can get them in titanium if you want to splurge, but these G10 handles are great and this texture works really well. The handles in general are ergonomically fantastic. What you can see here, you've got lines that are very similar to, can I find my Mannix? These are very similar to the Mannix. I don't have my Mannix with me here, but you've got a big finger choil, you got a big front finger index, and then you've got this big belly here, and the whole thing swoops down. What that means, this is a handle that locks your hand in. So you grab this thing, front finger goes in the choil right there. Rest of your fingers nestle right into these little bumps back here. Your thumb can either land on this jimping at the front, which is pretty solid jimping. It's not super sharp. They did round it down a bit in the stonewash, but it absolutely gives you traction. It's not purely aesthetic. Or you can even pinch back on the shark lock here, because this is laser cut jimping by the looks of it, and this is pretty sharp. This gives you some serious traction. This grip here or this grip here, first off, tons of control over the blade. You can see most of my hand is right next to or over the blade, whether I'm stabbing, poking, slicing, cutting, or doing something where I'm right up against the edge there, you know, holding something. Tons of control over the blade in this grip. And because I've got this finger secure in the choil, this finger here and this front index being held in by this curve here, and then this belly here giving my other finger somewhere to land. And then on top of that, because this is flattened, not too rounded, and then I've got the texture of the G10, this does not want to move in my hand at all. This is Sorry about that. This is a close second only to the Mannix in knives that you could literally, while this is in my hand, you could take a bat and whack the blade and it probably wouldn't budge in my hand. This thing is so secure in the hand, especially in this grip. And honestly, even if you choke back, you don't get that amazing front finger choil, but still these ergonomic lines, just your hand, they work so well at keeping your hand in place. This grip is definitely preferred, but this works really well too, especially when you get your thumb on that shark fin and anchor it there. Then you've got sort of a leverage point where this is pushing forward, your back fingers are pulling back, and the whole thing just sort of pinches the knife right into your hand. Now, what that means ergonomically is that this ends up being a very versatile knife. This is a knife that if you want to, you can pinch up. And, if I pinch up, I'm going to put my middle finger right behind this choil. And I'm going to be able to do my close slicing cuts, your paring knife type cuts. If I want to stab something, I can pinch right here and stab into something. Or I can grab on this choil here, stab into something, grab back here if I really want to just crank into something. If I'm doing cardboard, this is a great cardboard cutting knife. I'm usually going to grab it right here and do my long slicing cuts, and it will stay locked into my hand. There are very few tasks that the shape of this knife is not well suited to handle. And so it ends up being a very good EDC knife, a very versatile EDC knife because of that. Which then leads us to the blade, which is another high point. So if you know the Demkos as custom makers, if you've ever been fortunate enough to handle one of their customs or even handle one of their machine ground knives, they're known for three things, really. They're known for excellent handle ergonomics, which you see here. They're known for innovative and very utilitarian and effective lock designs, which you see here. And my favorite part is they're known for their blade grinds. And what they are known for is taking thick blade stock in general and still taking it down to these screamingly sharp edges. I had an original AD20 custom, and despite having 190 thousandths blade stock, that was one of the sharpest knives that I have ever owned. I only sold that one because the market for AD20s is so absurd that I couldn't possibly hang on to something that was commanding $1,200 at the time. That market is ridiculous, and fortunately there's a lot more AD20s and AD20s on the market. Prices have settled down, but it was insane for a period. Anyway, these blade grinds are really, really good. They're starting with 125,000 stock, which again is not that thick. And especially in a tougher steel like S35 VN is still all the thickness you need unless you're doing really dumb stuff with this knife. The grind carries most of its thickness most of the way out. You can see it's full thickness all the way out to here, and then only starts to taper toward the end. So this is a pretty thick stock. This one is actually, it gets a little thinner toward the tip, but it's still pretty thick stock the whole way through. At least it's keeping that stock thickness. It's not thick stock, but it maintains that thickness throughout, which again reinforces the toughness with the stock they have. But then it's a fairly aggressive flat grind that comes down to a, let's say, very sharp edge. You combine that with a stone wash that is really nice and evens this transition between the stone wash and the flat very nicely. And this becomes a knife that, especially in your harder use tasks, does exceptionally well. This is one of the best cardboard cutting knives that I have ever handled. If I've got a bunch of packages that came in, something like that, and I need to break down a whole bunch of boxes to take them out to the dumpster, this is one of the first knives that I would want to do that with. If I want to do home improvement stuff, if I got to cut through some drywall, cut through some twine, I'm not sure if I'd quite go to cutting through carpet. This would do it. I would like a knife that's a little bigger, gives me a little more leverage for something like that, but everything short of that, this is great. The one area that this blade starts to struggle, and I'll jump ahead a tiny bit and talk about one of the things I don't love quite as much, but it's really more a design thing than an execution thing, I will say this is a very sharp blade for your mid to hard use tasks. And a lot of the reasons it feels sharp isn't because it's sharp in the sense that it's super thin behind the edge, but because this blade stock, stonewash is so nice, the transition is so good, the blade stock is so reasonable that it passes through material very easily. You take this blade shape, you have to drag it through a whole bunch of cardboard. This clip point with a big belly up here and with a nice big flat glides through the material very naturally, stays in the cut very easily, very easy to control because these ergonomics are so good. Whether you're pinching and cutting down or you're cutting across, it just works very well for a very wide range of EDC tasks. The one time that you do start to get a little frustrated with this blade, and it's true for the slicer version as well, is it doesn't have the hair popping edge sharpness of something like a, like a Delica, something that is meant to be much thinner, much lighter. And so the one challenge with this as an EDC is for stuff like cutting tape or lighter, thinner tape, or for sometimes in the garden, if I'm cutting lighter plant stems, stuff like that. The edge doesn't always have, it's not thin behind the edge. It's not thick, but it's not thin. So the edge doesn't bite as much as some of the super sharp knives you might have. This will not be quite as sharp behind the edge as even your Para 3. And why is that? Well, the blade only has this far to drop. It's only got from here to here like 1 inch, not even 1 inch to drop. So even though the stock is thinner than your Para 3, your Para 3 is dropping all the way from the spine down to here. It does end up being thinner behind the edge, and the PM2 is significantly thinner behind the edge than this. And you do start to feel that when you go into your light duty tasks. This isn't the sharpest knife in the world. Instead, it's a little fatter behind the edge. That makes it a little bit tougher, and that makes it a lot more versatile. And it does make it a really good EDC knife that can shift into those harder use tasks very well, especially with this super aggressive and hand-holding handle design. The one place that the blade does start to sort of feel a little limited is in those lighter duty tasks. That's less the case if you get one of these shark lock variations, just because, as you can see, and again, this is a shark cup, not an 80-20.5, but the same thing would happen with these blades. This shark's foot blade does get pretty thin toward the tip, so if you're using, doing drag cut, stuff like that, this actually ends up being one of the thinner variations right at that tip. So if you want an EDC-centric 80-20.5, that might be the blade shape to look for, but it's going to be less versatile than these two blade shapes here. This one's sort of a middle ground, and this one is a traditional clip point, which is as versatile as a blade shape can get, and really excels at those extended cuts like you get in home improvement, like you get in breaking down cardboard, like you get cutting through twine and gardening, stuff like that. So there's a lot that these knives do really, really well. The action is fantastic. The space in the pocket that they take up is surprisingly phenomenal. I would say that is the most surprisingly excellent thing about these knives, is that this is a knife that feels heavy duty, feels tough, but is surprisingly slim in the pocket, and is slimmer in the pocket than most of the knives that you would be thinking about getting this instead of. This is slimmer than your PM2. This is slimmer than, if you were looking at a Hinder or something like that. Most of the knives that are competing with this guy in terms of functionality are thicker, and a lot of them are heavier to boot. The blade, for its intended use tasks, which is moderate to heavy duty EDC and is meant to be sort of a versatile blade stock, versatile edge sharpness, versatile blade designs, it works very well for that. And these ergonomics are fantastic, especially in that choked up position. Just gives you an immense amount of control over the blade. So there's a ton to like about these knives. And honestly, it feels like, just from that experience, a lot of the hype is deserved, not just for the fidget factor, but these are legitimately great users. And actually, before I go on to the cons, there's one thing that I do want to note, which is this review is specific for these newer variations of the 80-20.5. Back when the 80-20.5 came out, I jumped on some of the first versions that came out. I got a couple of the AUS 10 or AUS 8 versions, whichever it was. I also got a couple of the 3V versions that were Knife Center exclusives. Those Handle was still great, but the whole construction was a lot more rickety. The materials were a lot cheaper, but most importantly, the blade grinds were not nearly as good on those initial versions. I wanted to love that initial AD 20.5. I couldn't because it just couldn't cut. Like, I got both a clip point and a shark foot variation, and they sucked at cutting anything. The blade grinds on these two are what I would expect from a Demko, meaning they are very sharp straight from the factory. They have a very aggressive flat grind that comes down to as thin an edge as you could with what they're doing with the stock and the way they're setting up these saber grinds. And because they set this up with a saber grind that keeps the thickness so far out, you still got a very tough blade. They're great grinds. They're very functional, and the only stuff they don't work for is that very edge case where you really do care about edge sharpness. Now, for EDC, a lot of those tasks are in that range. If you're cutting paper, if you're cutting Amazon boxes, tape, twine, things like that, then, get something, get a Biblio, get a Delica, get something like that, get something that will be super sharp behind the edge. This won't be your knife. Everything excepting that, really good ergonomics, really good blade. In terms of what doesn't work, where these knives struggle, I already mentioned they're not going to be the single sharpest knife that you got. They show their performance most when they're passing through material, because the blade design, once the edge passes through material, there's nothing for it to get hung up on, and it just glides once it makes that initial cut. But it is not going to be the sharpest knife you have. It's not trying to be, but just know that it won't be. And especially if you're used to coming from something like a PM2. A PM2 is one of the few knives out there that, because of the way they do this grind, because of this tall, full, flat grind, this is a knife that you can both beat on and it's still super sharp behind the edge. That's pretty unique to the PM2 and other knives designed like it. Chris Reeve gets the same thing out of their knives. I mean, a lot of my favorite knives do that, but that's not what most knives can do. They've sort of got to choose. You want to be a little heavier duty or a little finer duty, and this one is definitely leaning toward that heavier duty side of things, giving up a little bit of that fine performance just from the way that they're ground. And you will see a lot of people get regrinds on these. People go to BGM or somebody like that and get these ground super thin, and that would be what you could do if you want to make your AD 20.5 a slicer. Or my suggestion is go see my review of the Shark Cub, because this is a slicey AD 20.5, and this thing is indeed slicey. So if you want that, go there. That's not what this is trying to be. This is trying to be a versatile knife that is small, slim, easy to carry, feels great in the hand, all of which it is. There's not really much that I have to criticize about this knife. I will say I've got one picadillo. I do not like seeing wampum PA on the pivot on a knife that is made in Taiwan. That is a personal issue. There's obviously nothing performance related about that, and they do very clearly mark that this is made in Taiwan. They're not trying to show that this is made in the USA. And this is not a Hoback situation. Everywhere that they market this, it is very clear that this is made overseas. They have never made any bones about that. It still just feels a tiny bit icky to me to have wampum PA on there for a knife made in Taiwan. I just wish that they'd kept, this Demko on both sides, something like that. That's probably because I grew up right next to the Pennsylvania border. Part of the reason I got into Demko. Demkos were some of the first custom knives I bought, and that's because I have an affection for anything made in Pennsylvania. So that's a personal thing, but I don't love it. That's really the only criticism I've got for these. On to your fit, finish, and value. Finishing on this blade is fantastic. This is a really, really nice stonewash. Nice and even. Very even edge bevels. Very nice plunge. Crisp, even. We already went over this jimping here, which was pretty sharp before the stonewash. The stonewash knocked it down a little bit, but and then the stonewash also knocked down the edge of that opening hole. Same thing on this one. Blade is finished very, very nicely. I would put this blade finish up there with Hinder and any of the best stone washes on the market. Handle, similarly, very nicely constructed. Nice chamfer all the way around on your G10. All your screws and pins are just about flush. Your screws are a tiny bit proud, but it's not too much. The finishing on your steel liners here is very flush. Those liners are just for basically where this shark lock mechanism lives. And you can see everything is very tightly fit together. And I mentioned that before, there's very little daylight between the edges of the knife and the interior of the scales. Everything just fits together very tightly, very nicely, which makes it feel very robust, very strong. It also contributes to why it is so slim in the pocket. And so there's nothing to complain about on the fit and finish front. And in a lot of ways, there's actually a lot to sort of celebrate or at least be impressed with at a $250 price point on the fit and finish front. This is, considering the fact that it is made overseas, it is made in Taiwan, so take that into account with your price, but I'm not going to complain about these at $250. Yes, it's G10 and 20CV or S35VN. And yes, you can get G10 and S35VN or 20CV for a lot less than $250. But the execution is there. This is on the level of Spyderco's from Taichung, Taiwan. Maybe a half a step lower, but close enough. And those knives tend to be sitting in the high 100 to low 200 range. And on top of that, you've got the shark lock here. You are absolutely paying for the shark lock, and the fact is the Demkos can charge for the shark lock because it is a more interesting lock than anything else that is on the market right now. It gives you a combination of security and fidgetability that nothing else can match right now. The only thing that people don't love about it, and I guess this would be the one thing, it doesn't bother me, but the one negative people have about this knife is the fact that there isn't a traditional detent. It does feel springy on the open. So if I look at my Para 3 here, so this one, right, basically I have to pull, and until that detent breaks, it won't budge. So, until I have to pull a decent bit before this moves at all. There's a detent holding it in place. On these, there is nothing holding it in that closed position. There's just spring resistance. So what that means is you get a springy detent, not a fixed detent. Now, some people say that feels mushy. Honestly, it does mean sometimes you need a little bit, if you want to flick this out, sometimes you need a little wrist to help it out because you don't have that detent you have to overcome, or you can just slow roll it. It's a different detent feel. It's very similar if you've had an axis lock, or anything of that variant, a clutch lock or whatever the 5 other variants are these days, any Benchmade, any Hogue with that sliding bar lock. It feels very similar to that in that the detent is provided by a spring, not a ball sitting in a slot. And so your resistance is spring-based, not overcoming 2 pieces of metal sitting on top of each other. It just feels different. It's going to feel weird if you're exclusively used to using compression locks, liner locks, frame locks prior to this. It might feel a little unsatisfying. It's a little weaker than something like a back lock, like a Spyderco back lock, like a native. It's different. I don't find it to be an issue. Even if it is an issue, it's purely an aesthetic issue. It's not a functional one in any way, shape, or form. There's nothing functionally bad about this lock. But anyway, back to the fit and finish and price. Realistically, you're going to pay $225 most places for these. And it's hard. If I'm building it up for materials, $225 feels on the expensive side. It's not insane, but it starts to feel a little pricey. But honestly, if I'm looking at other $225 knives in terms of function, are there any other knives in that $225 range that are offering way more function than this one does, that are way more useful, that are way more fun, that are as good in the hand, that have as good a blade design and blade finish as this? I don't think so. And I don't think there are any that are significantly cheaper that do that either. So the fact is, at the prices that they are selling these for, there is absolutely a markup here because of the level of, because of the Demko's relatively signature sort of ergonomic designs, because of the way they do their blades, and because of that shark lock. But they have delivered a knife that is better than a lot of knives made of those same materials. And so, to me, they've earned the right to charge what they're charging. And I don't feel ripped off paying $225 for these. And what you see is that they also hold their value pretty well in the secondary market, which is always a decent indication of whether prices are fair or not for large volume production knives. You're going to see these staying relatively close to that $200 mark, even on the secondary market if they're in new or newish condition. Getting closer to that $150 if they've been used or beat up a little bit. So fit and finish for me and price is fine. Even, frankly, a little bit better than fine. And so the conclusion, I will tell you, I have recorded this review twice. And the first time that I recorded this review, I was more critical of the blades because of the fact that they are not supreme slicers. And because of the fact that on those lightweight EDC tests, like I'll give a concrete example when I was gardening. When I do gardening, I'm cutting a lot of delicate plant stems, things like that. This is not the best gardening knife in the world because that blade just doesn't bite into those fine plant stems and fine leaves and things like that, quite like my usual gardening knives, which are things that are more like a Delica and stuff like that, or something that comes down to a sharper edge, even if it's a bigger knife like your Biblio, stuff that's meant more for an EDC to have a super slicey edge. The native, stuff like that. But this isn't trying to be that. This is trying to be a knife that is very, if you're looking at, if you've got a scale of, and let me just move this here. If you've got a scale of activities that you can use a knife for, where you've got your super slicey stuff on this end, and you've got your jab a knife through a car door hard use on this end. This is not going to be the knife for your super hard use stuff. Frankly, just get a Strider, get an XM24, or get a fixed blade. This is also not going to be your knife for your super delicate stuff. Get a Delica. Or if you want a shark lock, get a shark cub. This is not going to be super slicey. But you take those edge cases and move them in even a little bit. Anything except your most delicate and slicey tasks, this will do great. And this can go pretty hard. I wouldn't use this thing for a full day of cutting carpet, but I'd use it for, half an hour. And I would use it for breaking down drywall. I love it for breaking down boxes. It just struggles for those tasks that are either very extended or that are very hard use. And those are the places where your big chunky knives, your stuff like the military, the Shaman, your Striders, your big Hinderers, all that sort of stuff, your Chris Reeves. That's the stuff where they excel. This isn't quite as good as those. But for everything between those two extremes, you got a knife that is super fidgety. And by the way, one of the things I love about this that I forgot to mention before is I love anytime a good lock keeps your hand entirely out of the path of the blade. I have cut my hands by closing knives on them more than a few times. A couple times I've cut them quite badly. And it is a meaningful safety feature to me anytime that I can disengage this lock entirely without any part of my hand being in the path of that blade. That matters to me, and that is a serious reason. It's part of the reason I like the compression lock so much. That's part of the reason I like this one so much as well. You got a lock that's super secure. You got a handle that is ergonomically fantastic, especially in that choke up grip. You got blade grinds that, for what they're meant for, which is the medium to harder end of EDC tasks down to the lighter end of, hard use and around the house and even outdoorsy tasks. It's exceptional for those while still being able to do your lightweight EDC stuff. It's just not going to be the sharpest thing in the world for it. And then on top of that, it's surprisingly thin in the pocket. It's built very well. And it's at a price that, while it's not great, it's also not bad. And I think it looks very nice to boot. And I think just the way that everything has been finished, the way they finish this diamond pattern, the way they finish these blades, it's a very classic looking knife. I see a lot of more classic tactical knife sort of lines in here. I see parts of Terzarola's brain and things like that, especially in this clip point version. Just the way that it thins and thickens, the way that it keeps your hand contained up here, the way that this clip point balances, is just, to me, it's a very nice looking knife. I know that's aesthetic, that's my preference, but it's a very functional knife, easy to carry, not offensively priced. It's a great knife. It's a really great knife. And the fact is, if you are looking at one of these and you're just thinking, well, should I give it a shot? Absolutely. Because folks talk about this because of the shark lock, and folks talk about this because of that fidget factor. That is, to me, the least interesting thing about this knife. The interesting things about this knife are how capable it is for the amount of size and space it takes up, and how much performance and utility you get with how little pocket space it takes up. That is the most interesting thing about the AD 20.5, and that it does really well. Last thing, okay, let's say I've convinced you to get an AD 20.5. Pretend this is an AD 20.5. Which blade shape should you get? I've done a separate video at some point on this, but my favorite is absolutely the clip point. That's primarily aesthetic. I think this is a beautiful blade. But also, a clip point blade like this with a relatively high tip is going to be amazing at your longer slicing cuts, things like cutting through your cardboard, or things like, getting behind plant stems. That high tip is also very easy to get behind stuff, to get around stuff. If you're cutting up, if you're cutting down into stuff, it'll stay in the cut very nicely and easily. And on top of that, it keeps that stock pretty far out. It stays pretty thick. It's a nice tough blade. I find it very versatile. The only thing it struggles at are those direct down on the table EDC cuts or those drag cuts. But even for drag cuts, you can use the belly here and pull it through like that. This is my favorite blade shape of the bunch. The shark's foot, which is a sheep's foot blade shape, is going to be your choice if you want this as an EDC knife for your utility tasks, meaning you're going to be opening boxes, you're going to be opening packages, you're going to be doing stuff that is down on a table, drag cuts, pull cuts, things like that. You're going to be using this tip a lot. This shark's foot shape is going to give you more access to that tip, more easy access to that tip, and it's great for that. The problem is with any sheep's foot or Wharncliffe blade, now fortunately, Demko's put a bit of a belly on here, so this is less the case than some sheep's foots, but it is harder. Let's say if I'm cutting through cardboard and I'm pushing this down, sheep's feet do have a tendency to sort of come out of the cut more quickly, more easily. If you think about it, if you pull this tip up as I'm coming through, there's a significant period where this is going to be popping out of the cut when it would still be in the cut if the tip was higher. So you do lose some of the utility in those general all-around cutting situations, and you lose a lot of utility for stuff like home improvement work and for outdoors work, things like that. So I'm personally not a huge fan of sheep's foot blade shapes, but if you're looking for this and most of your use is going to be either down on a table or scoring or things like cutting boxes open, not breaking boxes down, but cutting them open, cutting tape, stuff like that, utility cuts, then that's your choice. The slicer shark is meant to be right in the middle. You can see the tip is right in between these two. Honestly, to me, it's a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none. It's not as good at your sort of all-around utility tasks as your clip point, and it's also not as easy to get down to that tip as your shark's foot. If you're only going to get one of these and you want something that is okay at everything, then it's an okay option. But I will tell you, it feels like one that is, especially once I've had the clip point and once I've had the shark's foot in the cub variation, it feels like a knife that is trying to be a blade shape that's trying to be everything, and so not quite being anything. So you're going to get mediocre performance across the board. It's great performance in the sense that it's still ground well, it's still sharp, but it's not going to be as great for the task that either one of these are great at. Still a great knife. If you like the looks, it's going to be fine for everything you need, but I would recommend that one the least. I would say figure out the sort of task that you're going to use, and that should drag you to one of these two extremes as your first. And then if you want to get a second one, then not a bad choice for the second, which will kind of round it out. And also, you get this peanut shape typically in your slicer, which is different. Again, I like the thumb studs, but it's different. So anyway, that's the AD 20.5. Really, really good knife. So much better in this updated version than it was in the initial batches. The initial batches are not knives that I would have recommended. These I can absolutely recommend. And these have, as I have used them, quickly become some of my favorite knives to actually carry and use. I've thought about selling these a bunch of times. Every single time I think about selling them or go to sell them, I go and start to use them again, and I remember why I've kept them around. They are just phenomenal at doing the stuff that you need a knife to do. What else do you need? Good job, Demkos. AD 20.5. Hope this long one was a good use of your time, and I hope to see you again soon.